Well, I'd like to welcome my guests to the program. First of all, Mr. Ken O'Keefe, out of London, peace activist and former U.S. Marine, and Mr. Lee Kaplan, out of San Francisco, investigative journalist. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start this off in San Francisco with Mr. Kaplan. The large numbers range from hundreds of thousands to millions of Iraqis who've been killed since the invasion of 2003, and the terror continues. Many experts say it is the U.S. and the U.K. who are directly and indirectly responsible for this loss of life. Your take, sir.
Well, first of all, the report you just gave was not accurate, and it really borders on absolute propaganda. People have short memories, which is what you're relying on. In 2003, Saddam Hussein had the biggest army in the Middle East. He was threatening the entire world, including Iran at that time. He was also funding, to the tune of $30,000 a pop, suicide bombings in Israel. They were blowing up buses full of civilians on a weekly basis. He was sword rattling and threatening the world. And he had already gone through one war with the United States over his attempt to invade Kuwait. And as far as weapons of mass destruction occur, or them being a reason, he could have opened up his weapons to inspection by the IAEA, and he refused to do that. So then the question becomes, when intelligence sources all over the world were reporting that he had the weapons of mass destruction, how could any government in good conscience let him continue with that? And that includes Iran, by the way.
Of course, unfortunately, as usual, you did not answer the question at hand. And if we want to get directly in the WMDs, we will get into that a little bit later. Let me cross over to Mr. O'Keefe. Mr. O'Keefe, your take so far on what Mr. Kaplan is saying, basically the United States, the UK, definitely justified in doing what they did because Iraq was a threat to the whole world.
Yeah, well, Iraq was our best friend and ally. In fact, Saddam Hussein was our favored nation trading partner. We were giving him weapons, agricultural support, financial support, political support. When he commenced a war against the Iranians, a war which the Iranians had no choice but defend themselves, he was using chemical weapons. This is not any kind of secret at all. He was using chemical weapons against not only the Kurds in Halabja and other Kurdish areas, but all over Iran, and in fact was attacking small cities and field hospitals with chemical weapons, and this, it is acknowledged, was by the assistance of the CIA. In fact, the whole world was supporting Saddam Hussein in the defense of America. At least everyone else, including even the Soviet Union, was supporting Saddam while he was slaughtering Iranians. And it is worth mentioning that the Iranians did not respond in kind and hit Basra and other major cities in Iraq with weapons of mass destruction. That goes hardly noticed in the rest of the West. Aside from that, Saddam Hussein was our favored nation trading partner while he was torturing dissidents and all sorts of stuff. And in fact, if he did have any weapons of mass destruction in 2003, well, where did he get them from? He got them from us. So the idea that any of this was necessary to defend ourselves is absurd. It is true, and it is absolutely self-evident to the whole world that the biggest threat to humanity is in fact those who are the biggest purveyors of weapons of mass destruction. And guess what? That would be Lee Kaplan's nation, the United States, my birth nation, the United States, who is the biggest producer, distributor, and user of weapons of mass destruction, including chemical weapons and even nuclear weapons. So the idea that we had to fight Saddam Hussein in order to protect the world is beyond absurd.
All right, well, Mr. Kaplan, let's look at the realities on the ground today. From 2003 until today, 2015, it has been nothing but chaos and bloodshed for the Iraqi people. We have people like former President George W. Bush, former Vice President, the former Vice President, and also Dick Cheney, and also Prime Minister of the UK that were responsible, who were leading the charge in 2003. Do you think that they should take any responsibility for what is happening even today? We know that no WMDs were found. No WMDs were found. Isn't that enough in itself to have them come up on charges?
No, and what? No. All right. Let me answer the question, okay? You know, because we understand this is Iranian TV, and if you want to get both sides, you have to allow for both sides. First of all, Mr. O'Keefe has a very short memory himself because he was a human shield for Saddam Hussein in 2003, protecting his government, and even Human Rights Watch back then commented about the fact that what he was doing was aiding the
Answer the question, Mr. Kaplan, please
regime.
stay on track. Go ahead.
I am answering the question, ma'am. I am answering the question, ma'am. And what you want to do is you want to pigeonhole me to make it sound like the United States and England are at fault here. He just made a statement that the weapons of mass destruction that he did use against Iran, for example, and against the Kurds came from the United States. No, they came from the French and they came from the Germans. That's a historical fact. He was a human shield for them back then. Iran has a stake today in trying to suggest that the United States and Britain committed war crimes. The fact of the matter is, the reason things fell apart there was because of the Shiite government that came into place in Iraq afterwards, and you've had a civil war since then.
Mr. Kaplan, we're talking about, let's look at the invasion, sir. We're talking about the invasion. We're talking about the crimes that were committed from day one of the invasion. We're talking about Fallujah and the chemical weapons and the weapons of mass destruction, if you want to say, if anything, were used by the United States. We're looking at now birth defects from Fallujah. This is what we're talking about. Who's responsible, sir? Who is responsible?
Well, I'll tell you who was responsible was Saddam Hussein. And again, you're not being truthful here, because the fact of the matter was Saddam Hussein was murdering an average of 5,000 Iraqis a week. He was a dictator and he was a killer, and he was doing that. And he was posing a threat to most of the Middle East. He had the biggest army in the Middle East. He had tried to build nuclear weapons, which the Israelis took out in 1986. To suggest that this was some peaceful nation and the U.S. and the British were out to take advantage of them is absolute nonsense and ignorant of history and the facts involved.
All right, Mr. O'Keefe, let me turn to Mr. O'Keefe. Mr. O'Keefe, if we look at the situation, stay with me, Mr. Kaplan. Mr. O'Keefe, if we look at the situation and what Mr. Kaplan is talking about, it's interesting. It would be at one point in time that Saddam become a terrorist, because most of the time he was actually one of the United States' closest allies. But if we look at today, why is it that we do not see the likes of a George W. Bush or a Dick Cheney or Tony Blair being charged with crimes, with war crimes?
Well, the short answer to that question is that the International Criminal Court is nothing more than a function of the powers that be, as is basically every Western government, as is the mainstream media, the police, the militaries. They all basically come under the control of those who control the money supply. Those who will dispute this are living in fantasy land, quite frankly. If you have an infinite supply of money, i.e. you're a private shareholder of a private bank such as the Federal Reserve Bank, the Bank of England, or the European Central Bank, and the other major banks, Bank of International Settlements. If you have an infinite supply of money, if you control that money, you can buy anything and everyone that can be bought. So the ICC, the International Criminal Court, the one that is supposed to be prosecuting the worst crimes, is controlled by them. So that's the short answer. Going back to what Mr. Kaplan said, just a couple of things. If I had had my way instead of him, which he's nothing but a chicken hawk who wants to send more American sons and daughters off to die for Israel, if I had had my way, we never would have invaded in the first place. And let's keep in mind that when we invaded, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. There wasn't even one Al-Qaeda member in Iraq. Now look at it. We've got ISIS, which is our creation just as well as Al-Qaeda. We've got ISIS running all over the place. That is a direct result of the policies of our government and our military while they invaded and occupied. It is the policy of Britain and America to sow the seeds of sectarian hatred, because this is perfectly in line with Oded Yanan's strategy for Israel in the 1980s. We always intended to totally destroy Iraq, to sectarian divide that place into absolute annihilation, and to weaken it so that eventually the goal of greater Israel can be employed and that Iraq can be taken over. This was the goal. So in that sense, the invasion and occupation of Iraq is not a failure at all. It has achieved largely its goals.
All right, stay with me both, Mr. O'Keefe and Mr. Kaplan. Stay with me. We're going to cross over. We're going to look at some of our Facebook comments by viewers. Well, let's turn back to Mr. Kaplan. Mr. Kaplan, you've heard some of our viewers' perspective. What about that? Is there different type of rules depending on who you are when we look at the situation that has taken place by the United States and the UK? And as one of our viewers said, according to Madeleine Albright, it was all worthwhile. We look at the military contracts and the money that has been made. Was it all about the money?
Madeleine Albright never made a quote to that effect of what you're suggesting in this broadcast. And also, let me point out to you something here. You stated that Iraq was a closest ally of the United States back then. They did have some trading partner benefits, but they were not our closest ally by any means. And you keep making statements like that to bias the argument in this case. Even your Facebook readers,
I did not say that it was the closest ally. I said it was a close ally, sir. If you're going to quote me, please quote me correctly. You just said that they were a closest ally of America. A close ally, and I stand by what I said. Mr. Kaplan, let's look at the whole situation. Do you think that in general that the United States took a very callous attitude going into Iraq? Basically, that the lives or what happens on the ground there, it doesn't really matter. It's almost like a game.
Absolutely not. Now let's look at the callousness here. You know, Iraq was exporting terrorism. They were paying $30,000 a pop for suicide bombers to blow up buses in Israel. They were threatening the rest of the Middle East, including Iran at that time. You know, I have a quote here from Ken O'Keefe back in 2003. From 1981 to now. Interrupting me, and are you going to debate for Mr. O'Keefe, or are you going to moderate the show?
Sir?
What's your question? Give me your question, and then let me answer without you interrupting.
My question is, I asked you about the callous nature of it all. For example, like the card game that was created by the U.S. military. These cards were sold at almost all stores in the United States with the most wanted on it. Most wanted Iraqis to be traded and bought as if a game. It was shown on live TV like a football game that everybody was watching the shock and awe that was taking place in their living rooms. Tell me about it.
All right. You asked your question about the cards. Those cards represented Iraqis who were the equivalent of the mass murderers in Nazi Germany. They murdered millions of Iraqis, 5 million during the course of Saddam Hussein's administration in that country. And they were mass murderers that they were trying to track down. They were the same as the Nazi SS that they were trying to track down. So what you do is you take a little thing and you try to suggest that they were just making a joke out of it with cards. No, they caught them all. They caught the majority of them, that is, and they even caught Saddam Hussein. So let's not try to obfuscate here. Let me give you a quote here from Ken O'Keefe. He wrote this in 2003. I depart by saying that any group of people, whether it is the disciples of Hitler, the Christian Zionists of America, or the Jewish supporters of Israel, or the brainwashed false Muslims. You know, I wonder if, when he says false Muslims, if he's referring to Iranian Muslims, Shiite Muslims also there. I say loud and clear, any group that believes they are chosen by God and thus superior to anyone else is an enemy of all humanity.
Okay.
Well, you know, your Supreme Mullah has stated that he wants death to America, and he wants the Iranian Revolution, the Shiite Revolution, spread throughout the world.
Mr. Kaplan,
so I would say that fits into his definition back then.
I'm almost out of time. Mr. O'Keefe, I only have a short period of time. I'll give it to you to answer. Go ahead, sir.
Well, thank you for the quote, actually. I stand by that 100%. My problem is indeed with those who believe they are better than everyone else. So whether that happens to be Nazis or American supremacists or Jewish supremacists or any other form of supremacists, you're interrupting me. I didn't interrupt you once. You're such a callous, chicken-hawk, cowardly man with no... I will easily debate you about the Holocaust. But nonetheless,
you will gladly blame the Jews for all the problems in the world, and you won't recognize the fact that this was a good thing that the United States
What a disgusting man. Your job is to go send off more American sons and daughters to die for Israel. That's what you want. 22 American servicemen a day committing suicide. 22 American service members a day, at least, committing suicide because of wars for Israel. And you chicken hawk coward who's never served in the military, you're a chicken, cowardly man who talks rubbish.
Thank you so much.